One of the things that really makes Visual Studio Code unique in the landscape, the panacea of text editors, is its ability to launch and debug applications right from inside the editor. And in order to understand how that works, we first need to understand a concept called launch configurations. In this video, we're going to take a look at what launch configurations are, how you can create them, and how you use them. Let's get started. All right, the simplest example of debugging in Visual Studio Code with JavaScript is to just come to the Debug tab and press the green button. And then any debuggers that you have will be listed here. If you haven't installed any, then you'll just see Node. Now, if we select this and run, this application will run. We actually don't have to do anything else besides just click the green button there to get that to work. And if we come here to the output console, we can see the output from the application. And we can debug this way as well. So if I drop a breakpoint here and run this again, then we can step over all the different debugging things that we'd like to do here. So in this case, we're actually running without a launch configuration. To add a launch configuration, let's click the gear icon and then we'll just select the Node platform. And the launch.json file gets created. That file gets created inside of a .vs code folder, which also gets created. Launch configurations are just JSON files and they have different properties, but they always have a type, and this is Node, that's our debugger. And then the request, there's launch, and then the other type is attach. So let's come back here and say attach. This is the other type of launch configuration. And depending on whether or not you have a launch or an attach, the other properties that you have may vary. So we'll go back to launch. And then the name of this, which was the name that will show up in the debugger here, and then it just asks which file you want to launch. So in our case, we called it index.js. So you can see here, this workspace folder is a variable that Visual Studio provides you with, and then index. So if I was to change this, and let's call this main. Well, now that's different than the launch configuration, which is here. So if we run this, let's save it and run. You'll see that doesn't work because it can't find the index file. So we can just modify that here, save it, and now let's run it. And now our application is working again. We can see here in the debug console. Yeah, perfect. Okay, let's look at a little bit more complex scenario. This is an Express application, so it's a little bit more complex. It's got some routes and a server, some views, some other JavaScript files here, package file. The way that you run this thing normally is that you run npm start, and that will go ahead and start up the Express application. We can actually take a look at that. So if we run npm start here from the terminal, let's just do that, npm start. And the application's running, and we can actually view this on port 3000. All right, so there's the application, and it's running. So if we wanted to debug this, we need to launch it from Visual Studio Code. Let's go back and create a launch configuration as we did before. So we'll do Node. And you can see that Visual Studio Code's pretty good about selecting your entry point here. So it knows workspace folder /bin/www is where my start file is. And sure enough, that's exactly where it is. So we can actually run this now from Visual Studio Code instead of running it from the terminal. So let's go ahead and kill this process here. And then let's go back to the debug and just click start. And this will run inside of Visual Studio Code. And then when we make a request here, because I've added a breakpoint, you can see that it breaks right here. And we're now in the code with a breakpoint, and we can debug here over on the side, look at the variables, add watches, examine the call stack. Let's go back over to our launch JSON file and look at a couple of other things. There's a lot of different other properties that you can use inside of launch configurations. So one of them is called environment variables. So this is an interesting one. So environment variables are variables that we pass in Node that are sort of like configuration values. So one that Express uses is called port. If I change the port, let's say I change it to 3001, and actually these need to be strings, 3001, then this will now run, the application will run on port 3001 instead of port 3000. Let me show you. We start that up and we go back and refresh, you'll see our application's not running anymore. But if we were to put 3001, now it works. Okay, so that's some different things that we can pass in here. Another thing that we can do is if we had a .env file, we could just point directly to that .env file here, by giving it the name of the .env file, and then it would load all of our environment variables in. There's a lot of different things that are in here. There's args in case you want to pass some different arguments to the program. You can even do specific operating system specific configurations. So things that you just want to happen on Linux or OS 10. I recommend going through the documentation and looking at all of the different things that we can do here inside of the launch configurations. So we don't have time to cover all of these things in this particular video. So now I want to take a look at a different type of launch configuration. And to do that, we're going to need to install something called the Chrome debugger. So I've already got that installed. You can see here debugger for Chrome. So you just want to install that. It's got 5 million downloads as the time of making this video, so quite popular. And we're going to use that to debug a SPA application with a launch configuration. So this application is a React app. It was created with Create React App. It's not really that fancy. And we want to run this thing. So the way that you run a React application created with Create React App is you run npm start. And if we run npm start, this will fire up a browser window. It will connect. And now we're running our React application. But if we wanted to debug this React application, that's commonly done inside of the developer tools, the browser developer tools. And so if we wanted to add a breakpoint, we could come here and let's go to our sources and just look at the app file. And we can just add a breakpoint on this template whenever the page loads. So if we go back and reload, this breakpoint will get hit right here. But it's really actually a much nicer experience to be able to debug from inside of Visual Studio Code. Debugging your code in the same place where you write your code is a much more cohesive experience. So let's take a look at how to do that. To do that, we're going to create a launch configuration for this project. Again, we're going to come to our debug tab. We're going to click on the gear, and this time we're going to select Chrome. Now on the Chrome, we have Chrome. It's a launch type, and we're going to launch Chrome. It says we're going to launch Chrome against localhost, and it's got a URL here. Now let's go back over and check out our URL that we're running on over here on our site. This is port 3000, you can see. So let's come back here and let's change this to port 3000. And the source code for our application is in a folder called source. So if you come back here, source, so actually want to add the source path down here as well. And now we can launch this and debug inside of Visual Studio Code. So watch this. If I click this, this will fire up and you can see we've launched a different window here and we're now attached with the debugger inside of Visual Studio Code. So if we were to open up our app.js file here, let's close this and put a breakpoint. We'll go back and refresh, and now we can debug inside of Visual Studio Code, which is really, really nice. All right, the last thing that I want to look at is something called compound launch configurations, and that's simply just more than one launch configuration. So let's go ahead and stop this, and we'll head over to this project here. Now this project has two different components. It has a front-end component here in the source folder, and it has a back-end component here in the server folder. So when we run the front-end's a React app. Remember, we run that the same way that we would run the other React app that we just ran, which is just npm start. And this will go ahead and fire up our application. And you can see that we have an error here, and that's because the backend server hasn't been started. So the backend server portion is here inside the server folder. So we would actually have to, let's open a different terminal here. And let's move into the server folder. We can say node server.js, and this starts the backend Express server. So that's running there. Let's come back over to our application and we refresh. You can see now we've got an application here. It's actually pulling data back from a database that's coming from the back end. But we want to launch both of these things from Visual Studio Code. Instead of having two separate processes here, it'd be nice if we could launch and debug this whole project, front end and back end, in Visual Studio Code. And we can do that with compound launch configurations. So let's go ahead and stop both of these processes. And I'm going to close this terminal window. And let's go over here to our launch configuration and take a look at what a compound launch configuration looks like. So you can see here at the top, we have a compounds element. That's the first element. It has a name and it specifies two configurations. What are these configurations? Well, those are these things down here. So the first one is this launch browser configuration. and it has a pre-launch task of npm start. It knows the URL to attach to, and the workspace root is source. So this is actually going to launch the browser and run pm start at the same time. And then this second one is going to just launch the server, and that's really very easy. It's just going to launch that server.js file. This one compound command is going to start both of the configurations below. If we come over here to the side and we click on our little arrow here, you can see we have all of those different configurations right here. So we have the two different ones, and then we have the compound here. So if we want to launch both, we'd click here, click the arrow. Now our application is running. If we go back to Visual Studio Code, you can see we've got each of those listed over here to the side, which means that we can debug both of them. So let's say, for instance, that we wanted to have a breakpoint in app.js here, app.js over at the bottom of the file. Just put one right here. And then let's say we wanted to have one on the routes here, which is on the back end. So we have one on the front end, one on the back end. If we refresh, now we hit the front end breakpoint. And if we keep going, now we hit the back end breakpoint. So there we go. Now we're debugging both the server and the client application, all inside of Visual Studio Code and all using launch configurations. So that's launch configurations inside of Visual Studio Code. A very powerful feature that allows you to run and debug virtually any application that you're building inside of the editor right from inside of the editor. Those are launch configurations, and Visual Studio Code can do that.